Hello and welcome to Wild West Faces. Today's story is an account by George Catlin, telling of the time when the Dragoons, led by Colonel Dodge, had their first official encounter with the Southern Plains Indians. Now, not all meetings between the Indians and the white men were brutal. This, being one of the first encounters, was actually a very friendly encounter. Listen to the details of this amazing encounter between white man and Native American, and imagine how things could have been had all encounters been this friendly. We hope you enjoy this story here on Wild West Faces.
On the fourth day of our march, we discovered many fresh signs of buffaloes, and at last, immense herds of them grazing on the distant hills. Indian trails were daily growing fresh, and their smokes were seen in various directions ahead of us. And on the same day at noon, we discovered a large party at several miles' distance, sitting on their horses and looking at us. From the glistening of the blades of their lances, which were blazing as they turned them in the sun, it was at first thought that they were Mexican cavalry, who might have been apprised of our approach into their country and had advanced to contest the point with us. On drawing a little nearer, however, and scanning them closer with our spy glasses, they were soon ascertained to be a war party of Comanches on the lookout for their enemies. The regiment was called to a halt, and the requisite preparations made and orders issued. We advanced in a direct line towards them until we had approached to within 2 or 3 miles of them, when they suddenly disappeared over the hill, and soon after showed themselves on another mound farther off and in a different direction. The course of the regiment was then changed, and another advance towards them was commenced, and as before, they disappeared and showed themselves in another direction. After several such efforts, which proved ineffectual, Colonel Dodge ordered the command to halt, while he rode forward with a few of his staff and an ensign carrying a white flag. I joined this advance, and the Indians stood their ground until we had come within half a mile of them, and could distinctly observe all their numbers and movements. We then came to a halt, and the white flag was sent a little in advance, and waved as a signal for them to approach, at which one of their party galloped out in advance of the war party on a milk-white horse, carrying a piece of white buffalo skin on the point of his long lance in reply to our flag. This moment was the commencement of one of the most thrilling and beautiful scenes I ever witnessed. All eyes, both from his own party and ours, were fixed upon the maneuvers of this gallant little fellow, and he well knew it. The distance between the two parties was perhaps half a mile, and that a beautiful and gently sloping prairie, over which he was for the space of a quarter of an hour, reining and spurring his maddened horse, and gradually approaching us by tacking to the right and the left, like a vessel beating against the wind. He at length came prancing and leaping along till he met the flag of the regiment, when he leaned his spear for a moment against it, looking the bearer full in the face, when he wheeled his horse and dashed up to Colonel Dodge, with his extended hand, which was instantly grasped and shaken. We all had him by the hand in a moment, and the rest of the party, seeing him received in this friendly manner, instead of being sacrificed, as they undoubtedly expected, started under full whip in a direct line towards us, and in a moment gathered, like a black cloud, around us. The regiment then moved up in regular order, and a general shake of the hand ensued, which was accomplished by each warrior riding along the ranks and shaking the hand of everyone as he passed. This necessary form took up considerable time, and during the whole operation my eyes were fixed upon the gallant and wonderful appearance of the little fellow who bore us the white flag on the point of his lance. He rode a fine and spirited wild horse, which was as white as the drifted snow, with an exuberant mane and its long and bushy tail sweeping the ground. In his hand, he tightly drew the reins upon a heavy Spanish bit, and at every jump plunged into the animal's sides, till they were in a gore of blood, a huge pair of spurs, plundered, no doubt, from the Spaniards in their border wars, which are continually waged on the Mexican frontiers. The eyes of this noble little steed seemed to be squeezed out of its head, and its fright and its agitation had brought out upon its skin a perspiration that was fretted into a white foam and lather. The warrior's quiver was slung on the warrior's back, and his bow grasped in his left hand, ready for instant use, if called for. His shield was on his arm and across his thigh. In a beautiful cover of buckskin, his gun was slung, and in his right hand, his lance of 14 feet in length. Thus armed and equipped was this dashing cavalier, and nearly in the same manner all the rest of the party, and very many of them leading an extra horse, which we soon learned was the favorite war horse, and from which circumstances altogether, we soon understood that they were a war party in search of their enemy. We dismounted, and the pipe was lit and passed around. And then a talk was held, in which we were aided by a Spaniard we luckily had with us, who could converse with one of the Comanches, who spoke some Spanish. Colonel Dodge explained to them the friendly motives with which we were penetrating their country, that we were sent by the president to reach their villages, to see the chiefs of the Comanches and Pawnee, to shake hands with them, and to smoke the pipe of peace, and to establish an acquaintance, and consequently a system of trade that would be beneficial to both. They listened attentively and perfectly appreciated, and taking Colonel Dodge at his word, relying with confidence in what he told them, they informed us that their great town was within a few days' march, and pointing in the direction, offered to abandon their war excursion and turn about and escort us to it, which they did in perfect good faith. We were on the march in the afternoon of that day, and from day to day they led us on, over hill and dale, encamping by the side of us at night, and resuming the march in the morning. During this march, over one of the most lovely and picturesque countries in the world, we had enough continually to amuse and excite us. The whole country seemed at times to be alive with buffaloes and bands of wild horses. We had with us about 30 Osage and Cherokee, Seneca, and Delaware Indians, employed as guides and hunters for the regiment, and with the war party of 90 or 100 Comanches, we formed a most picturesque appearance while passing over the green fields, and consequently, sad havoc amongst the herds of buffaloes, which we were almost hourly passing. We were now out of the influence and reach of breadstuffs, and subsisted ourselves on buffalo meat altogether, and the Indians of the different tribes, emulous to show their skill in the chase and prove the mettle of their horses, took infinite pleasure in dashing into every herd that we approached, by which means the regiment was abundantly supplied from day to day with fresh meat. The tract of country over which we passed, between the false Washita and this place, is stocked not only with buffaloes, but with numerous bands of wild horses, many of which we saw every day. There is no other animal on the prairies so wild and so sagacious as the horse, and none other so difficult to come up with. So remarkably keen is their eye that they will generally run at the sight when they are a mile distant, being no doubt able to distinguish the character of the enemy that is approaching when at that distance, and when in motion will seldom stop short of 3 or 4 miles. I made many attempts to approach them by stealth when they were grazing and playing their gambols, without ever having been more than once able to succeed. The Indian, when he starts for a wild horse, mounts one of the fleetest he can get, and coiling his lasso on his arm, starts off under the full whip, till he can enter the band, when he soon gets it over the neck of one of the number, when he instantly dismounts, leaving his own horse, and runs as fast as he can, letting the lasso pass out gradually and carefully through his hands until the horse falls for want of breath and lies helpless on the ground, at which time the Indian advances slowly towards the horse's head, keeping his lasso tight upon its neck, until he fastens a pair of hobbles on the animal's 2 forefeet, and also loosens the lasso, giving the horse chance to breathe, and gives it a noose around the underjaw, by which he gets great power over the affrighted animal, which is rearing and plunging when it gets breath, and by which, as he advances, hand over hand, towards the horse's nose, he is able to hold it down and prevent it from throwing itself over on its back, at the hazard of its limbs. By this means, he gradually advances, until he is able to place his hand on the animal's nose and over its eyes, and at length to breathe in its nostrils, when it soon becomes docile and conquered, so that he has little else to do than to remove the hobbles from its feet and lead or ride it into camp. This breaking down or taming, however, is not without the most desperate trial on the part of the horse, which rears and plunges in every possible way to effect its escape, until its power is exhausted and it becomes covered with foam, and at last yields to the power of man and becomes his willing slave for the rest of its life. By this very rigid treatment, the poor animal seems to be so completely conquered that it makes no further struggle for its freedom, but submits quietly ever after, and is led or rode away with very little difficulty. Great care is taken, however, in this and in subsequent treatment, not to subdue the spirit of the animal, which is carefully preserved and kept up, although they use them with great severity, being, generally speaking, cruel masters. After many hard and tedious days of travel, we were at last told by our Comanche guides that we were near their village, and having led us to the top of a gently rising elevation on the prairie, they pointed to their village at several miles' distance, in the midst of one of the most enchanting valleys that human eyes ever looked upon. In the midst of this lovely valley, we could just discern amongst the scattering shrubbery that lined the banks of the watercourses, the tops of the Comanche wigwams, and the smoke curling above them. The valley, for a mile distant about the village, seemed speckled with horses and mules that were grazing in it. The chiefs of the war party requested the regiment to halt until they could ride in and inform their people who were coming. We then dismounted for an hour or so, when we could see them busily running and catching their horses, and at length several hundreds of their braves and warriors came out at full speed to welcome us, and forming in a line in front of us as we were again mounted, presented a formidable and pleasing appearance. As they wheeled their horses, they very rapidly formed in a line and dressed like well-disciplined cavalry. The regiment was drawn up in 3 columns, with a line formed in front by Colonel Dodge and his staff, in which rank my friend Chadwick and I were also paraded, when we had a fine view of the whole maneuver, which was picturesque and thrilling in the extreme. In the center of our advance was stationed a white flag, and the Indians answered to it with one which they sent forward and planted by the side of it. The 2 lines were thus drawn up, face to face, within 20 or 30 yards of each other, as inveterate foes that never had met, and, to the everlasting credit of the Comanches, whom the world had always looked upon as murderous and hostile, they had all come out in this manner, with their heads uncovered and without a weapon of any kind, to meet a war party bristling with arms and trespassing to the middle of their country. They had every reason to look upon us as their natural enemy, as they have been in the habit of estimating all pale faces. And yet, instead of arms or defenses, or even of frowns, they galloped out and looked us in our faces, without an expression of fear or dismay, and evidently with expressions of joy and impatient pleasure, to shake us by the hand, on the bare assertion of Colonel Dodge, which had been made to the chiefs, that we came to see them on a friendly visit. George Catlin.